Devansh, which email did you send it to?
Oh, I texted it to you. Would you like me to email it to you?
Oh, no, no worries. I got it. All right.
Dr. Boyd, I see you joined the call.
What time does it start?
Hmm?
All right. All right. She should be joining us shortly.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chief. All right, and see, Dr. Boyd is also here. Okay, there we go. I see her.
All right, there we go. I'm back.
All right, how you doing, Dr. Boyd?
Good. Thank you for having me. I was having some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I noticed, but it all worked out.
Thank you.
Just I see the deputy chief. Um, just give a few more.
Looks like we're all here. Deputy Chief Watson's in the room too.
I see. All right. So I guess we can get started now. First, I'd like to say thank you for everyone for joining this call. It takes a lot to come together and discuss these issues, so I'm really happy to see everyone. I'd also like to thank the speakers. We have Deputy Chief Watson from the City of Hartford, Chief Higgins with the Yale Chief Police, Dr. Boyd, who's Assistant Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, also a professor at the University of New Haven, and Dr. Cooper, another professor of criminal justice at the University of New Haven. So just before we start, I just want to give everyone a quick overview of what's going to happen. So we're going to hear from these experienced speakers for at most 5 minutes. So that should take about 20 minutes. And then what I know what a lot of you are here for is the open discussion that's going to take place after. And how that will work is that you will DM me or private chat me the questions, and I'll read them out loud to the speakers. And just so things work smoothly and we don't have any internet troubles, I would like everyone to please turn off their cameras except for me and the speakers, and to please mute yourselves just so things run smoothly. And last but not least, let's please be respectful. We're all here to come up with solutions and achieve the same things. We're all on the same team. We all want to see progress. So let's just keep that in mind. And yeah, let's get started without further ado. Let's start with you, Dr. Cooper.
Is there a specific question I'm answering?
There's not a specific question, but just we'd like to hear your perspective and thoughts on what we can do as, you know, citizens, and what just the current state of our society and what needs to be done.
I think that in the moment that we're experiencing, particularly in the United States, you know, with the global pandemic that is COVID-19 and the national pandemic that is, of course, racism, I really want to just encourage people to do a gut check. And what I mean by that is to individually center themselves, hear themselves, listen to their bodies, and ask themselves what about this situation makes them uncomfortable. Sit with that uncomfortability. Does it make you uncomfortable to see someone die on screen? That makes me very uncomfortable, right? Does it make you uncomfortable to feel uncertain as to whether or not justice will prevail and accountability will be present? That makes me uncomfortable, right? Does it make you uncomfortable, you know, to see that millions of people have gathered, or that, you know, policies are changing, or that, you know, press conferences are happening around these topics? Different things are going to cause each of us to feel unsettled. And I want you not to flee from feeling unsettled. I want you to realize that many people, especially Black people, are in excruciating pain at this time. They are really having to challenge themselves about how to manage their day-to-day and their well-being. And that does not exclude those of us who operate in the criminal justice field. I am not in the depth of field, of course, as Chief Higgins or Chief Watson, but as someone who is integrated into the conversation of criminal justice, who actively does justice research, who actively spends time in the reform and policy space. That's really what I'm also dealing with myself, is that gut check. And I think the piece is that don't let it in with the gut check. Don't let it in with the reflection. There has to and must be action. If you cannot figure out one small thing to do in this moment, then you should sit down and think harder until you can, because there's so much to do and there's so many different levels and ways to contribute and to speak to the pursuit of justice, the denouncement of white supremacy, the denouncement of racism, and that there's the opportunity for humanity to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. That was very well said. Chief Higgins, would you like to pick up from there?
First and foremost, thank you for having me, and thanks for creating this space for members of the University of New Haven community to talk. I want to also thank Dr. Cooper for pretty much setting the table. And the reason why I use that term, setting the table, is because she has pretty much defined or explained how America's feeling, especially people of color. Let me say something. Someone asked me, Chief, why did you become a police officer? And I shared with them that my dad was a police officer. I guess had my dad been a minister or a mechanic, he would have, you know, been what I saw, and I would have become that. But I didn't. I became a police officer. Fast forward almost 25 years later, a couple of weeks ago, while getting dressed and putting on my uniform, watching CNN as I was preparing for work, I had tears in my eyes. Tears in my eyes, because this uniform that, you know, is supposed to symbolize public trust, it is now a symbol, and has been, but admittingly, has been a symbol of pain for Black and brown people in this country. And that pain has been just multiplied exponentially with the killing of George Floyd. First and foremost, let me say that as an American police officer, I am sick to my stomach. As a Black man, I am conflicted, and I'm doing exactly what Dr. Cooper said, finding that thing to do as a police chief, as someone who leads an organization, as someone who has a Black son and a Black daughter, as someone who right now, when this country is looking for answers, someone who wants to get rid of racism, while at the same time keeping ourselves and our communities safe amidst a global pandemic. This is on our watch right now. And as a professional, I have to say to you and those who are in the criminal justice program at the University of New Haven, anyone who's taken my class has heard me say, I want them to know what they're getting themselves into. I no longer have to talk so much about what they may see, what they may experience in the history of policing. And I'm not talking about Sir Robert Peel. I'm talking about the slave patrols, and I'm talking about the suppression of Black people the oppression of Black people during Jim Crow. I don't have to explain that as much as I had to in previous semesters, because right now it's playing out before their very eyes. So as I close my remarks, I just want to let you know that I'm full with all sorts of feelings and emotion: hurt, anger, mistrust, a sense of purpose is starting to develop, because as we hear from the Black, white, brown, red, and yellow people in this country, once we get to a point where we can all work together to rid racism, I think that is the first step. And I believe that people coming together the way that they have over the last few weeks is a sign that this one's different. This one's different. I digress.
Thank you, Chief Higgins. That was very well said. I think it was really important for all of us to hear that perspective, especially as a Black police officer. You know, I can only empathize with what you're feeling. Dr. Boyd, would you please continue?
Sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, and I certainly appreciate the words of my two colleagues, who admittedly I know well and work with pretty regularly. And I think we're all pretty much at the same place. And I've spent the better part of the last 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, explaining to people over and over again what's going on. And a couple of the media interviews, they asked me, who was George Floyd and why is he the catalyst? Then I had to explain that it's not just George Floyd, and I went through a litany of other people to say that this problem has been going on. And I go on to say that the people that are protesting now, the people that are in the streets now, it's their parents and their grandparents that were marching in the 50s and 60s. And it was their grandparents who were just trying to get the right to vote. And marching for things that the Constitution says that we so richly deserve. But then the police would sick the dogs on them, and the fire department would put the hoses on them. And it was the peaceful protest. And then we move forward, we keep seeing these peaceful protests. And if you fast forward with Colin Kaepernick and the NFL taking a knee, a peaceful protest. But even that, people lost their minds. So when people take protests further, and eventually people have their backs against the wall, and again, I'm not excusing or justifying. As a classically trained sociologist, it's my job to explain human behavior. But at some point, people have their backs against the wall, and they're tired of the peaceful protests, and they're tired of their votes being wasted, and they're tired of writing the letters, and eventually people lash out when they feel they have no other option. And then we start to see riots coming. And then we notice even in Baltimore, we've known how bad Baltimore PD was. It's been bad for generations, and we've talked about it. And Hollywood knows how bad it is. They've made 2 TV series, Homicide, Life on the Street, and The Wire, talking about how bad Baltimore PD was. But no one did anything. No one said anything. Right after Freddie Gray, they protested. No one cared. But it wasn't until the rioting started and CBS burned down that the whole world took notice of Baltimore. And that's when the Department of Justice decided to step in. What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to build bridges between the hurt and pain and people in power, so we don't have to burn CBS down, so people don't have to burn buildings, so people don't have to riot. If I can bring people to the table to understand the level of empathy that is needed and understand the level of pain that people have, then we can move forward. But we also acknowledge, the level of privilege that we all have. I understand that when I leave campus, I go to my semi-suburban home, and I understand being an assistant provost, being a Black man with a PhD. I understand the level of privilege that I have. But I also understand the neighborhood I grew up in. And I also understand before I became Dr. Boyd, and I still understand that there are times people in society view me as though I'm a potential threat. And then we talk about the concept of the unarmed Black man. And then I keep asking, if my skin color is seen as a weapon or as a threat to you, am I ever unarmed? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. I don't even know what to say. That was very well. It was really, really nice to hear. And I think for a lot of us, it'll give us a lot to think about in the coming days. I like how you started all the way back in the 60s, because that's what racism is. It didn't just appear today. It's deeply rooted in our society, but it's up to us to change that. So thank you. Deputy Chief, can you hear us? Chief Watson? Oh, there you are. You just have to unmute yourself. Yeah,
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. All right, and then. So you can see me and you can hear me. I can't see myself, but you can see me.
Right.
Okay. Well, you know what? I don't even know where to begin, because I can echo with all the sentiments that I've heard. Guess I don't really have a lot to say, because you know what, going on with what Dr. Boyd just said, and I think that I want to say, right, that for me, becoming colorblind is where it really starts. And I don't know what vehicle or what it would take for society, our society, for the world to go, globally, for one to be less colorblind, because, just as he said, right, the concept of being an unarmed Black person, or just being a non-Caucasian. I'm Black. It's not, something that I think of every single day, but every day I wake up, I'm still Black. So it's not the first thing on my mind, but I'm always gonna be this. So, I operate as a female, but not necessarily as a Black female, but everybody else sees me as Black before they see anything else. So when does that go away? Can it go away? Will it go away? I don't know. So, we need to be unified. I think that with everything that's gone on, and the mere fact that we're having this pandemic has given us the opportunity to pause. And so this is our time. But we do have to be cognizant, and we do have to be really clear about what it is that we want to do when we unite, so that we can have a better effect and change along, I want to say, a residual change, because we've had riots before, we've had protests before, we've done things that have had momentary impacts, but they've dwindled. And then we've gone back to, incidents where we've had George Floyd. And since that, we've had other incidents, because we had the one where someone got shot in the back because they fell asleep in the drive-thru. Now that should have never happened. You know, in the wake of George Floyd, should someone else be, you know, reckless and having, you know, deadly force? No, but it's continuing to happen, and you have to ask yourself, why is that? And had it been someone of a different skin color, would that have happened? You know, because there were several other options. They could have let him walk home. They could have driven him to his sister's. They could have done 1,001 other things short of him losing his life. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's a bigger, broader brush than the one that we currently have. You know, and again, right, if we could change our skin color, would we want to? I like being the color that I am, so I don't know what the solution is. I guess that's my, you know, contribution for now.
Thank you, Chief.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I guess now we'll start the questions portion of the discussion. Just message them to me, and I'll read them out loud. So we already have a few. This is just up to the panel. What are your views on the viability and effectiveness of civilian review boards?
I can start that if I may. I'm a huge fan of civilian review boards. I think that people say that unless you're a cop, you don't understand what it's like to be a cop. I've been in uniform. I'm not in uniform, and I do understand that there's nothing about being a sworn police officer that I need to understand shooting somebody in the back is wrong. There's absolutely nothing about going through a 6-month academy that I need to learn that kneeling on somebody's neck for 9+ minutes is wrong. So the other problem that we have, particularly in a strong union state, and I came out of Massachusetts where we had really strong unions, a lot of major cities have unions. Unions protect police officers, but they also protect bad police officers. What we need is civilian review to do two things. One, civilian review can help deal with a lot of the problems that start off as internal. Some of the internal investigations, it'll kind of free up the internal affairs to handle the major things. If there are smaller complaints, then citizen review can handle that. But the flip side is citizen review is also good for collecting information about police officers when they do things right. Because we never get a letter or an email or a phone call when a police officer in the rain changed somebody's tire. You know, we don't get those calls, but citizen review boards can pick up on things like that as well. But the other side of it, and the side that I think most people are leaning towards, a lot of times we see negativity with the police and they go to internal affairs and it's non-sustained. Well, if I may borrow a quote from Johnny Cochran, who polices the police? We police the police. So a citizens review board that have people in the know on the board, I think can be really, really effective.
Okay, so picking up from there, you say a civilian review board with people that are in the know. So how does one become in the know? So we have civilian review boards and they work in conjunction with our internal affairs. Okay, so they hire independent investigators who will also investigate the case, and internal affairs also investigate the case. Then they come up with their conclusion and we come up with our conclusion. Sometimes they correlate, sometimes they do not. The civilian review board have at their discretion the opportunity to petition the chief if they so desire. If the conclusions were so at a dichotomy that they would petition. I mean, I've not known of them to petition the chief, but I guess it could happen. Civilian review boards, from my perspective, have to go through a learning curve because oftentimes they're unrealistic with their expectations and what it is that they are investigating. Again, from my perspective, when a citizen has the opportunity to make a complaint, oftentimes they check off absolutely every single thing that's on that complaint form. They check off things that may be relevant and things that may not be relevant. Once they've checked it off, the Civilian Review Board will investigate everything. And it may or may not be pertinent to the situation they're actually complaining about, but their findings really don't have any impact on the officer. And I do agree that there are, but as in life, there are people that, you know, are less desirable than others. So it's not just necessarily because you're a sworn police officer that you're gonna be a bad person. There are people with characteristics in life that are not necessarily folks that you would invite home, not just because they're police officers. And not every single police officer that has a citizen complaint is non-sustained. Complaints are sustained. When I used to work in internal affairs, I've actually arrested police officers, trust me. I've had police officers who have resigned because of complaints that have been made. I've had police officers that have been demoted because of complaints. So, you know, I don't know about, I can't speak about other police departments, I can speak about ours. Our police department is fair, is equitable. So, you know, our internal affairs, we do the best that we can to be fair and to be consistent with what we do. Once in a blue moon, things happen, that is true. We're all human after all. I mean, and as I say, right, we include civilians, not just in reviewing our police officers, we also include them in our recruiting process. So, you know, we're very engaged with the community.
So I want to follow that up. I want to follow up Dr. Boyd and Deputy Chief Watson. I just want to come at this from a different angle. I want to talk about two things. Civilian oversight of police departments isn't foreign. It's not a national standard, but you know, there are lots of police departments that have civilian oversight. The second thing is what I've been seeing over the last, probably close to a decade or more, is that, you know, let's face it, not everyone believes the police anymore, and we need to. There's a culture issue in many departments, and in order to maintain our legitimacy, we're going to have to work with civilian oversight boards, so that they understand that our practices are in fact meeting our in alignment with our policies. And if in fact our policies are in alignment with our practices are in alignment with our policies, that the culture of the organization isn't bad. In other words, what we saw in Minneapolis, we saw one officer who murdered a black man with his knee, and we saw another officer who was very visible on that tape, who felt more strongly about confronting the people who were trying to get him to stop than he did for that man's humanity. So for me, that shouted of culture. And those of us who've been in this business for some time know that culture eats policy for lunch. We can have all the best national standards. We can have the most best promising and emerging practices, and we should. But unless we start to root out the culture, the bad culture within organizations, then the policies aren't worth the paper that they're written on. So civilian oversight helps improve accountability, and they should.
I just want to tie together the pieces, because what we are discussing is, on one hand, an idea, right? what does it mean to involve the public in what is the safety of their community. And what Chief Higgins broke down really well is there are going to be different policies. That's also what Chief Watson pointed out, right? Like the policies within one locale don't have to be the policies in another. And so the named Citizen Review Board will have differential participation in different parts, right? Chief Watson talked about not only when a problem arises is there opportunity, but there's recruitment opportunities, there's other opportunities. But what Chief Higgins nailed is without the proper culture, without relationships that create shared value around public safety, shared values around humanity, then, you know, to Boyd's point a few minutes ago, like, how am I not to be perceived as a threat? How am I supposed to be perceived as a part of the solution? How am I supposed to be perceived as part of the collaboration and part of the community while you view me as a threat? So then how being in places and spaces where we create relationships and bonds is one of the ways that we diffuse the misconceptions that we have about each other. It's a lot harder to say all police fill in the blank, and it's a lot harder to say all community members fill in the blank when you have to more overtly engage with more police, or as the police, you more overtly engage with your community. And that's essential. So whether or not we call it a community review board, community oversight, whether or not it's just the police themselves being active in their community policing and getting community voice and perspectives and, you know, doing that kind of PR on the ground in a different way, it is essential to have bonds and trust, as Chief Higgins pointed out. And without that, then everyone's kind of giving everyone else the side eye. The community sees the police. Am I okay? Are we cool? And then, you know, the police see the community and they're like, are you reaching for your camera? Are you trying to, you know, make this a thing that it's not? You know, everyone is very on edge. And these type of tactics, you know, from an ideal perspective, can be helpful. It does matter how we implement them, though.
Yeah, I think this is all very well said. I'm not going to comment on it too much because all you guys have already did, so I'll just move on to the next question. So referring back to Dr. Boyd talking about the need to build bridges and calling to mind recent incidents of police brutality and the use of deadly force in New Haven, including Paul Witherspoon, Stephanie Washington, Solmain Mubarak, and the fact that protesters have been occupying Bridgeport PD for over 3 days now over the murder of Jason Negron. How can we in Connecticut, associated with the criminal justice system, be active in taking that first step forward to start rebuilding relationships with those that have been affected by police violence? What is the first plank that can be built in that bridge? Is it holding individual officers accountable more immediately with increased severity of punishment and transparency? Or something more systematic like ending the 1033 military equipment leasing program?
Well, I think it actually starts way before that. The way we start is by having communication. And kudos to Chief Reyes in New Haven, who stood on the steps of the police department reaffirming their oath. And that's a symbol. It's a step forward. And then you saw a couple of days later that Chief Reyes was sitting on the steps of the police department with the protesters having conversation. So we acknowledge that people are upset. We acknowledge the history. The question is, what can we do to move forward? And I also applaud the Connecticut State Police for when the protesters took over I-84. That could have gone south so quickly, but the state police walked up on the highway with them, and they marched with them, and they took a knee with them. And then once the point was made, the protesters decided to vacate the highway and go back to, go back to the street level again. So there's a lot of police officers, there's a lot of police chiefs that are trying to work with communities. I saw Chief Doty up in Hartford the other day talking to a bunch of community members. That's the start. So the demand may not necessarily be the start. The communication part is the start. And I acknowledge a lot of people are saying they've been talking and it hasn't worked. I say we keep talking. We can't abandon the conversation because virtually all chiefs, Chief Higgins with his department, when they do training, they do lived experience. They bring in community members sometimes with police officers to train. And when I did the training for Yale PD, the first 4 hours, community members and police officers were together because I need the officers to understand the lived experience of the people that they're policing. And I don't want the police to come in and thinking of them as others, but thinking of them as community members that have issues, that have victories, that have successes, that have problems, just like everybody else. And the more we can see community members as partners in this, the better things are going to get for everybody.
I would just, add, to me, it's helpful to break down the question in terms of who we're talking about, because you mentioned like justice involved people. So for those of you who are future justice professionals, right, or just generally a student, right, this is the time that you are supposed to be learning. So if you are in classes that are not talking to you about tough topics, then now is also the time to call your university to order, right? How do we continue to challenge? I teach a class called Youth Injustice in the Khalif Browder Story, and the main feedback that I get from students is, why are topics of injustice not more of a forefront? Why is there's a good amount of conversation about what we need to do, what are the processes, what are the rules, but where's the conversation about how I can be put in a situation as a professional where my ethics are challenged, where someone's life is put in my hands, right, where I have to use deadly force. Now, I have a different answer for the people who are leaders, right? People who are already professionals in the setting. They should ask themselves, why now? What's different, right? Because the issue is not new. The harm is not new. The pain is excruciating, and it's reached a point where, honestly, while I want to be thankful for some of the, performative actions that Boyd mentioned, I'm not to the point, right? I'm thankful for the action I've seen. I'm thankful for seeing, certain disciplinary action, or, communication to the public about the timeline for release of information. Like, the community has been talking, but that does have a point where it stales, and the need for action does not require more talking. The need for transparency does not require more talking. It requires for someone to take action. And so for people who are leaders, they have to challenge themselves about their competencies. Build that up, right? If you don't know enough about diversity and inclusion, or you don't know enough about the people that you serve in your community, then you should be seeking, from an ethical perspective, to be better at your job, better at your role, better serve in a leadership position. Because we need leaders, we need strong leaders, and we need people who are not suited to lead to step out of the way.
Dr. Cooper raises so many good points, again, and Dr. Boyd as well. So I teach a class at the University of New Haven, race, gender, and class issues in policing, race, gender, and class issues in the criminal justice system. And probably right around the second or third class, students are looking at me and they know what I do. They know who I am, but I ask a question. And I ask the question of, some of you starting to believe that I am anti-police officer? And a few of them want to raise their hand. And I said, no. I said, the title of this course is Race, Gender, and Class Issues. Let's begin with race. I said, for me to sit up here as a chief of police and as your professor, I need to speak the truth. There have been and will continue to be race, gender, and class issues in our criminal justice system and in policing. So we need to talk about these things now in the classroom so that you develop an understanding of where these issues are and you develop the core competencies that Dr. Cooper was talking about. Conversely, I think we need to her point, start to look at the core competencies and the suitability of leaders. Because for those leaders who have their heads in the sand are saying, well, that's in New Haven, that's in Hartford, that's in Bridgeport, that's in the urban areas. I think they're in for a rude awakening, and I think that it's coming soon. It's not just in the urban centers anymore. People are demanding justice. And when we're talking about justice, I'm not just talking about, and I don't want to minimize this, so I'm not just talking about the shooting of unarmed Black men or police violence by way of excessive use of force. What I'm talking about is, people being treated differently because the color of their skin, like Dr. Boyd was talking about earlier. I was in Target this morning. Now I'm about 6 feet, 265 pounds. I was in Target this morning, and as I was walking into the store, I had to be mindful because there were some women who were there, and they looked at me, and I wasn't paying attention. And it almost felt like I had to minimize myself and make myself less threatening to them and put a smile on the face when really I had the weight of the world and a lot on my mind. I wasn't an angry black man. I'm just a person in black skin who was very pensive at the time. So I think we need to be truthful with our students in the classroom, and as Dr. Cooper said, as leaders, one of the things that she said when we opened up this discussion was that you have to be comfortable in your uncomfortableness. That which makes us uncomfortable right now, we have to confront it and ask the question of why it makes us uncomfortable and push through it, because we can no longer perpetuate what's been done already. This is about action. There's folks who have taken to the streets. There's those of us who are inside of departments, leading departments. It's just going to take action from all sectors, both inside the department, outside the department. It's going to take legislative action. And at the same time, because this is a learning community, we need to be truthful with our students.
Thank you, Chief. So the next question is, does the example of Camden, New Jersey's successful revamping of their police force fit in other areas of the country?
Camden is not a microcosm of policing. And when there was oversight in Camden 5 years ago, I was on part of the team that did the oversight. There are very few police departments in the country that I think are as bad as Camden used to be. So when we talk about dismantling the police, most times we're not talking about actually dismantling, although Camden City was one that was dismantled. And there are probably 3 other departments that I could think of off the top of my head that if we were to dismantle them, it wouldn't be a bad thing. But the whole purpose of what happened in Camden was there were so many complaints, so much stuff going on, that they decided that they were going to decertify all the officers and have them reapply for their jobs based on a particular community standard that was made up by the city and the residents. And ultimately, what they did not decide was, we're not going to have policing in Camden anymore. They said this particular police department is so corrupt that they went from a Camden City model to a Camden County model. And the county model of policing that they did was more community oriented. And we see metro departments all the time: Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Miami-Dade, Las Vegas, Indianapolis. There's lots and lots and lots of metro departments. So that's not a new concept. The new concept was that they actually stood up and they had a whole bunch of officers that shouldn't have been police officers that they were able to get rid of. And I applaud them that they were able to get rid of them. But the key is, after that, I remember when they started decertifying officers, there were T-shirts going around the city with that date, and it said the day the bad guys took over. But one of the things we found in Camden, its violent crime rate is at a all-time low, or at least a low for the last 20 years, because they brought community members in with police officers that weren't corrupt. The police officers that were allowed to retain their jobs were good officers. But sometimes you have to do broad sweeping change if you got a whole lot of bad officers. And let me just say for the record, good officers don't want bad officers on the job either. So it's just a matter of having a mechanism or a release valve to get officers out. And sometimes the extreme of what happened in Camden is what was needed.
Can I just follow up Dr. Boyd's point? One of the things that I've been talking about and will continue to talk about, and I believe we probably will see some action here in the state of Connecticut, is our licensing boards. So in other words, every police officer is certified in the state of Connecticut. In other words, they have a license to police. Think of that licensing board for police officers as the DMV. when you start to build up some infraction, there should be points on your license. That's the way the DMV works. And if you screw up and don't pay a ticket or do something egregious, you lose your license. We need to look at how decertification works in the state of Connecticut. And right now, the Police Officer Standards and Training Council, which is the licensing board for the state, has voted to expand the reasons why an officer can be decertified. And I have to tell you, in 2020, we're just now voting on the fact that when an officer is found guilty of using excessive force, he or she can be decertified. But this is 2020. Mm-hmm. We've now voted on decertifying an officer for a bias incident. But this is 2020. And it took George Floyd, it took Ahmaud Arbery, it took all these different things to happen at the same time, and most likely the COVID pause as well, for us as leaders in policing to get together and say, we've got to get rid of officers once we start to see, once there's an appearance of wrongdoing. So I think we're making headway. I think there's still a lot to do. And I think that this is a time, when we just talking about COVID, one of the things that I learned with COVID, because many of us weren't prepared, is that we had to innovate our way forward. And I say for this crisis as well, we need to innovate our way forward. Leave that which did not work in the past, and those things that we innovated and we learned from, and we learned to use as a result of COVID. That is what we need to carry into the future. So the same thing goes for police reform. We need to innovate our way forward. There's tons of information out there, task force reports, other best practices. But often some of the best and promising practices come about when the community, when different communities work together with their police departments. So what's good for, let's say, Atlanta or New Haven or West Haven or Bridgeport or Hartford, it may not work in other municipalities. However, it works for this community who those officers are accountable to.
I agree, and if I can just add to that, you're exactly right. Going back to Camden, so community policing, we know, is always a base where we start from and where we can grow from. And I think that historically we've always had police departments that have been corrupt, and eventually you can weed out the corruption and then start all over again. So some police departments have had to rebuild. And you're exactly right. If you have honorable police officers with integrity, they don't want to work with police officers who are less than honorable. That being said, I agree with you that now, because we've had this COVID pause and because of other things that we've had along the way, and with best practices that we can look at and see, and with sharing amongst other municipalities, right, and things that work, not necessarily you can take it and you can change it, you can modify it so you can use it for your own department. What we've discovered is that, right, we're humans too, we're not infallible, so it is time to make the change so that we can say, you know what, once upon a time we believed as an entity that we were untouchable. That's not the case now, because we do want to be humanized and we do want to interact and we want to fuse ourselves into the community and into society, and we want to be acceptable, we want to be approachable, we're three-dimensional, we do want to be able to protect and serve, okay, fine. But then on a good day, we want to make sure that the community, society can interact with us. If they see us, we don't want them to cross the road, they can come by, they can engage, they can say hi, they can have a conversation. They shouldn't only speak to us when there's an emergency and when we're telling them to, put their hands behind the back because they're being arrested or apprehended. So with that being said, right, we want to interact and we want to have common sense to lead us. So yeah, if you're going to be deviant just because you're in blue or whatever color your uniform is, right, that is no longer your shield of protection. So yes, we want to have a woven in common sense, into the laws that, and as you say, right, all the regulations that we use to certify us, to make sure that we can stay and be police officers. So it makes practical sense that we should reflect on what it is that our standards are for us to continue to be certified and be the police that are supposed to be protecting and serving society. So no, absolutely. And then, you know, on the days when you're not in your uniform, right, if it shocks your conscience, why shouldn't it shock society? So again, we do reflect on what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Because, like, look at me, I'm not in a uniform. I don't wear a uniform on a day-to-day basis, but yeah, I'm still a police officer and I'm supposed to abide by all the rules and regulations that my police department dictates by. But you know what, on my way home, if something happens, right, I don't automatically think, oh, I'm a police officer. I'm just a citizen. And if it offends me just the same. So yes, you know, I'm going back to Dr. Boyd, right? Yeah, absolutely right. I believe that communication, and I believe that being accessible to anyone, you know, your community, anybody that wants to come and interact with you, right? Again, we're not untouchable because we are human beings. And, you know, as a female, right, I can be somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's aunt, somebody's best friend. And then when I need to be, I can be law enforcement who has to take action, whether it be to protect someone or whether it be to apprehend somebody else. So if I'm doing something wrong, I should be held as accountable as the next person. So society has to change and the police department has to change, and the laws that govern the police department have to change too.
Thank you. So our next question is actually an interesting one. When I came to the USA 20 years ago, after 37 years in the UK police service, I soon became aware of the racism that existed in society as a whole, albeit just below the surface. Police are recruited from that society, and in order to get the best candidates with good ethical behaviors and competencies, should we not be promoting a very rigorous assessment of candidates with the substantive educational standards when we recruit?
You know, that's an interesting point. Two conversations with two chiefs come to mind. One, I heard an interview with the former police commissioner from Chicago right after he was removed, Gary McCarthy. And in the interview, he said, people think that just the police have a race problem, and that's not the fact. It's not just the police. America has a race problem, and it's manifesting itself in policing. And if you go back about 15 years, I was working with Dallas police, and I was talking to the then police chief, and we talked about racism within his department. He said there's no racism in Dallas police at all. He said, I know everyone that's hired, there's no racism. And he said the city of Dallas has a lot of racism. It's one of the most racist cities he's been to. So then I asked, well, where do you get your police officers from? He goes, oh, almost all of them come from the city of Dallas.
Well,
and I
that's
just
a
gave him the
contradiction.
side eye. Yeah, I just gave him the side eye. So again, if we point the finger at the police only, we absolve society of their problems, because to say only the police are racist is hugely problematic. America has a huge race problem, and we need to deal with that, because if we don't deal with the race problem nationally, we're never going to be able to deal with the inherent biases that are present within policing.
Agreed. And we do have a rigorous recruiting and a rigorous process that we go through to hire police officers. Having said that, it's a psychological, I guess, deficiency that we can't always detect, because who you are will always eventually surface. And unfortunately, the testing process and even the academy process may not be sufficient time for one to be able to detect what may eventually surface. And it requires you interacting with the public for it to become self-evident. But the process that we go through is rigorous. And whomever it was that posed the question, right, they posed the question, it's a good question, but what evidence do they have that it's not rigorous?
I think they're part of the argument might be, you know, would we be where we are if it was as rigorous as we need it to be? I just would add, I know nothing about police testing because I'm not a police officer. But I would just pose the question, what if to be a police officer, you had to do similar to when you're in the military and you're trying to get clearance, right? They make calls, right? I've been the person called by the US government. Do you know this person? Does this person love their country? Maybe we could trade that for like, is this person, you know, have you seen this person ever exhibit any racist behaviors? Have you seen this person exhibit any other problematic behavioral cues that we could know to look for? I know that we do references, but I feel like the military kind of does like higher order form of like trying to get people to attest to your character before they give you certain military clearance. And I think that military clearance and like having a gun, you know, we should maybe consider bringing that option, you know, in.
Well, can I share with you that we do psychological evaluations, we do home visits, we also do background checks, we do credit checks, we do polygraphs. Let's see what else. You know, there's I want to say like a 400 questionnaire that you complete that gets evaluated by a psychiatrist. And then that's cross-referenced with the actual psych eval that you go through. You know, of course, there's the medical evaluation. I mean, there is a litany of things that one has to go through, and again, they do the home visit, they talk to your neighbors, it's extensive. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's not, I don't know what your perception was or is, but it's pervasive, to say the least. So yeah, you know, I mean, obviously we're not going to catch everything. And then, yeah, it is, you know, and then there's a lengthy process that they go through for you to learn to use the firearm and to respect the firearm, because a firearm is only as good as the person that is operating it. So, yeah.
Let me jump in before Chief Higgins jumps in, if I may. Mm-hmm. Part of the problem is the structure of policing itself, because policing in America is a white male-dominated occupation. Over 70% of police officers in this country, and there are 800,000 cops in this country, over 70% of them are male. And I'm sorry, over 70% of them are white and over 80% of them are male. So the lens of policing by default is a white male lens. So in order to change racism in policing, we have to change the structure in policing.
I just wanted to add one more idea, right? As a faculty member who's a tenure track faculty member, I had to do my job. Well, I did mine for 5, but normally people do their job for 6, 7, sometimes 9 if you had like Yale. And I already have a base competency, right? I have a PhD when I come in. So I've done all of the rigor that anyone who knows criminological theory or practices from an academic place should know, but I still have to be in the job for 6 or so years before they assess me as to whether or not I should stay in the job. I wonder if there should be some sort of follow-up period where, you know, you've had a chance to get ingrained in your police culture, you've had a chance to build your chops and identify your own ethics in your role as a police officer. And then I don't know if it takes 6 years, but maybe at the 3-year point or the 5-year point, there could be an additional assessment potentially, because something is happening where we're missing people. And it might be that they're fantastic people when we hire them. I can't attest one way or another, but when the policies aren't enough and the culture is so thick that you start to socialize to a culture, right? Then how do we then, you know, deal with higher order issues that happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years after you're a police officer that aren't a part of that rookie year and aren't a part of that rookie training?
That was a fantastic question and
Mm-hmm.
great discussion around it. I'm a fan of early warning systems, early intervention systems, but early warning systems and early interventions aren't used to their fullest if we're only receiving information from outside the agency. In other words, I'm going back to culture yet again, because inside the department, for me, there's no secrets. Okay, if people aren't doing things that are within policy or are ethical, instead of socializing to that culture, we need to be saying no. We need to create an environment where, the bad officer or that officer which doesn't want to play by the rules, doesn't want to do right, that's the individual that needs to be ousted. But we can't just rely upon our communities to make complaints. If it weren't for videos, if it weren't for cell phones, um, so much would not have been exposed thus far. So we also need, for those, because this is a moment in time, right? This is a moment in time. We need officers inside our departments to, call people out.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need to do right now.
I agree. We need integrity checks. So, and that speaks back to when you had mentioned earlier about the officer that was just standing and engaging with, the civilians rather than paying attention to assist. And agreed, right? Because that's one of the things that they teach you, right? Where you become culpable if you stand and you do nothing when you're supposed to. So that comes back to ethics, which is one of the courses that they teach you. And I'm going back to, I think what Dr. Boyd said, that he believes that it's a cultural change that we need, because there's 70+% that's, Caucasian and male. And that leads back to the idea, right, that, based on Obama's 21st century study that he did, right, in that, each police department should reflect the community that it serves. And so we have to change the perception that society has and that the minority society has about what a police department does and what a police officer is. Because in order for us to recruit more individuals that look like the society that we're serving, we do have to change that perspective of who should be in the police department and how we can recruit individuals that look more like the minority that are in the police department. We try to recruit more females, we try to recruit more minorities, we try to hold on to them. But that is tough, that's difficult. So that's where it starts. In order for us to have a change, we've got to make a change. And how does that happen? So we have to teach the younger individuals, start with your students, that they need to become police officers, they need to get into law enforcement, they need to be FBI special agents, whatever it is, right? But they have to engage, they have to enroll, they have to go through the academy, right? Because if we don't have them in law enforcement, right, we're never going to be able to infiltrate and have it change the numbers so that it's more than just white males, so that it's more than just males. So there can be more females, there can be more of a mixture of individuals that are there that reach the supervisory positions. So that then we can say, okay, you know what, we need more Black instructors in the academy so that we can make those changes to the policies and the way that things are done.
Chief Watson, the question you raised about, what do we need or what's missing is really the perceived value of diversity and inclusion. We need to continue, to get to the innovation that Chief Higgins talks about. It's hard to be innovative when you are surrounded by the same, and when you're the same and everyone around you is the same. And so it's not so simple as, just add one type of officer or another. That I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm just saying part of it is challenging yourself, as we already said, about being uncomfortable. How do you go find someone who thinks differently than you? I like to use the example of cuisine. it's great if I can cook a hamburger, but if I have friends and now I got a friend that can cook some Brazilian cuisine, and now I got a friend who can cook some French cuisine, and now I got a friend, then my whole flavor dynamic and the ideas and the robustness of what we come up with is so much different than what I would have come up without them. And I want to be over there. I want to be in innovation, but that requires people to value diversity in the first place and not feel threatened by the premise that they don't have to be the only something in a space.
Danielle, trust me, I know this.
Yeah.
There are, let me see. I don't even know what to tell you, right? I have been a minority, an anomaly for the majority of my career. There is just me, and I continue to be just me. You know, so trust me, I know this. What would I give for flavor? You know, and I speak to, and I talk to, and I try to entice as I go along, anything and everybody. I'm very open to everything, you know. But again, we try to be as diverse as possible and to be inclusive, because we have limited resources, but we do the best that we can with what we have, and we're not trying to segregate or even to say, you know what, that it has to be one particular way. It can be anything. It can be everything. It can be metropolis of every single thing. And I like the idea, and I like that you use food. I love food. So yes, I'm into cuisine.
Okay, I think I'll move on to the next question. Do you believe that the size of police forces has an effect on the level of disconnect between officers and communities they're supposed to protect? Take the NYPD, which is a massive organization that overlooks many different communities throughout NYC. Does having one blanket police force for all of these communities infringe on that community engagement, which therefore leads to more violence? Would several smaller forces help alleviate this?
You know, I've that's a great question, and I, I don't know the answer to that. You know, NYPD is the largest police force in the world. It's a small army, and I think as we talk about police reform, I think that the NYPD would probably say that, well, each precinct is distinct unto itself, and therefore they've achieved that connectivity with their community through that model. But I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a really, really good question.
I just want to say hi, Dr. Cooper from St. Louis, Missouri. Very like less than 10 minutes away from Ferguson, where Mike Brown died. Part of the policing issue in my hometown is the number of small police agencies in a very small radius. You can drive 10 minutes and hit 10 different police departments. And then you have to deal with 10 different sets of policies and cultures. And that's a whole different nasty, ugly feeling, because you make progress, but then now you have to make progress in 10 different decentralized places, even though they all are within 20 minutes of your home. And so I know your question focused on big, but I just wanted you to know that I've existed in the space where there are a lot of tiny police departments. And I think everything has to be nuanced is the point. And I think, the point of precincts, meaning, I think that's a really good point, Chief Higgins. Where is the locus of control? Where is the response? Like, is there someone responsible? And how close is whomever to the top to the issues that are on the ground? Do you know what I mean? I don't necessarily know that I can say New York Police Department needs to be smaller, because based on my understanding, the levels of person-to-person crime versus, organized crime that they also have to deal with are very, very, very varying, and so I think I think this brings up to some extent, and I don't know if you're going to go there, the conversation of defund the police that is a part of some of the, protest cries right now. I also think that has to be nuanced. How much is the police funded before you defund them? Where are the other gaps in funding? Where will the money go? Like, these are all very valid questions that all have to be nuanced as we start to think about the resource to the community that is policing. Right? Because that's what it is. It's a resource to the community. The goal is to keep the community safe, right? The community wants safety. The community wants, to some extent, law and order. But when it becomes oppressive, nobody wants that.
You look at police departments, most departments across the country are not major departments. Most departments across the country, I would venture a guess, would have 30 officers or fewer. So that's one of the issues. And when you talk about the mega departments like Chicago and New York and LA, I was on a call a week ago Monday with the mayor's office in LA, Mayor Eric Garcetti's office, and they were talking about reallocation of funding. Because the term defund the police in most situations is just reallocation of funds. And that's something that I would guess that Chief Watson and Chief Higgins deal with all the time with the people that hold the purse strings for their respective departments. Departments are trying to get more resources, and the cities or municipalities or universities are trying to not give as many resources. So the reallocation thing happens all the time. But when we were talking to Mayor Garcetti's office, I often talked about crime not being the problem, that crime is actually symptomatic of larger problems in society. And if we deal with those larger problems, then we don't need as much enforcement. So when you look at a typical police budget, between 80 and 85%, and again, I'm talking national, not any one individual department, between 80 and 85% of all police budgets are personnel, salary, benefits. And of that 80 to 85%, probably 15 to 20% of that is overtime. So if we reallocate the overtime money and put it to reducing the need for overtime, then that to me seems like it's a good it's good resources, a good use of resource. So when we were talking about the reallocation of money from LAPD, they actually took $125 million from the budget in LAPD. $125 million. That seems like a lot, doesn't it? But LAPD's budget is $1.8 billion. And when you talk about the police department in the city of New York, which is the largest police department in the world, its budget in New York is bigger than a lot of countries. NYPD's annual budget is $11 billion. And the vast majority of that is for personnel. So to break up a department, and I'm not saying one way is better than the other, I'm just laying out some information so that we're comparing apples to apples here. So to say if we move LAPD or NYPD or Chicago PD into smaller departments, that's what's supposed to happen, because originally we wanted this centralized policing location where there's one headquarters where we know where the bosses are. But when we went into community policing, we decided to decentralize. And then we started moving captains or watch commanders or lieutenants in charge of their individual districts or individual precincts. So that's a model that we were going to. But we also understand that there are different rules for different people, and different communities are policed very differently. So at least if there is one, and again, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but if there's one major department that has one policy, then we know, or we hope for the most part, that people are going to be treated the same way. And I would also advocate if we had a national standard for how we do policing, I think that would also be good as well.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you. I'd like to first thank everyone for coming and supporting this discussion. I'd like to thank the speakers for donating their time and their experience and knowledge. Just so everyone knows, this is recorded and it will be up on YouTube. So you can, if you know someone who wasn't able to attend, you can always send this link. I'll be posting the link on my Instagram, so you can follow me there. And I realized that there were more questions than we had time to answer. So I took a picture of everyone who asked a question, and I will get back to them after this to make sure their questions are answered. And I'd just like to give a special thanks to my parents for supporting me, and especially my father for the technical side. I'd like to also thank my criminal justice professor, Dr. Michael Jenkins, for mentoring me throughout this whole process, and also Aditi Bhatt for helping me organize and market this event. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone, and please take what you learned and apply it, and don't let this discussion end today. Please go out and make these discussions on your own. Reach out to your police department or people in power, and create these discussions on your own. Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good job,
Good job.
Devansh.
Good
Take care.
job.
Be nice to people, wash your hands, social distancing.
Right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Good job, Devansh.
Thank you, doctor.